In this video, we're going to take a look at the gradient overlay layer style. Now, let's go ahead and get this applied. I'll click on my effects button with the stick figure layer selected and just choose gradient overlay like so. And you can see straight out of the gate, this applies a gradient all the way across my layer. Now, before I even worry about adjusting the settings too much, I do want to take a look at the gradient line within the properties. We have the ability to immediately reverse the gradient if we want to, and of course checking that box gives you a pretty obvious result. We're just kind of flipping around the order in which the colors appear. If you click on the little black arrow, you can choose any of the preset gradients. If you just click on the gradient itself, this brings up the gradient editor where you can adjust the color flags of the gradient. You can click in an empty space to add a new color flag. You can change the color of that flag and so on. Though I do want to kind of give a heads up that my intention here isn't necessarily to show all of the cool ins and outs of the gradient editor. We'll be handling that in a separate video. So I'll go ahead and cancel out of here. And we'll start at the top with our various settings. First off, we have blend mode. Now, all this is going to do is take that gradient overlay and adjust its blend mode to anything else you might want it to be. So, for instance, I could set this over to add, and we're adding this to the green that was underneath. So now we're going from a paler green to this nice brilliant yellow because we're basically adding on some purple all the way up to orange. Let's go ahead and set this back over to normal, make this a little easier to see. Next we have opacity, so you can adjust that, and that's just taking that gradient overlay and boosting its see-throughness so that you can see what's underneath with those original pixels. Just keep in mind, though, that if you have something like the fill opacity set down to nothing, and you start to pull down the opacity of your gradient overlay, then suddenly you can't see what's underneath because those underlying pixels have had their fill set to 0, which means they're transparent. Just keep that sort of thing in mind. Now, we have style as well. By default, this is set to linear, and that means you're getting a gradient that is marching along its color range in a straight line. That's all there is to it. You can take the angle and you can change that. So if I set the angle to something around 0, you'll see that the gradient is running from left to right. If you're having a hard time visualizing, of course, you can pull down the scale, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a moment. So there's the result of linear. We have several others to choose from. We have radial, which basically just goes from this center point of the layer out. You're not limited to that, though. I do want to mention this. It's a very nice trick that is easy to overlook. At any time, you can click and drag in your document while you have your gradient overlay properties open, and you can position this gradient exactly where you want it to be, which is even cooler when you go to something like radial, where you can put that gradient wherever it must be. So we can reverse that if we want to, just like you saw earlier, and of course we can adjust the scale. I'm going to put the scale back up at 100% for now. Now, of course, angle isn't going to do a whole lot with the radial gradient. You will see a result, though, because the radial gradient is using the measurements of the layer to figure out how big the gradient is going to be. Our layer is taller than it is wide, so if we run our angle in a direction that is longer, the gradient will appear to get bigger. If we start to run our angle in a direction where the layer is short, you'll notice that our gradient gets smaller. So if you're using a radial gradient with an oblong shaped layer and you need the gradient to get larger, we need like this little radial area to increase in size, of course you can tweak the scale if you want to, but if that's still not getting you where you want to go, try adjusting your angle so that it coincides with the longer dimension, and that should make your radial area a bit bigger. So that can really help you out if you need to do that. Next we have an angle gradient. It's a little hard to see given our restricted size, but what this is doing is just giving you kind of a clockwise result where you're starting at one color and then you're sweeping around a center point, almost like if you've ever seen kind of like a radar screen where you got like that line that just kind of sweeps around. That's pretty much what's going on here. And as you change the angle, that sweep just rotates around. I don't often find myself using this. I find that kind of jaggy line to be a little on the gross side, but it's cool for those couple of edge cases where you might actually need it. So the scale isn't going to do a whole lot in this particular case because there's really not much to scale. The whole thing is procedural and it's going to go on to infinity however you work this. Now next we have reflected, and this is going to start at one color and just go out in both directions. So it's kind of like linear, but it is nice for metallic effects and things like that. And if I pull down the scale, it's a little easier to see what's happening. We're starting at purple, and we're going out to orange in both directions, perpendicular to our angle. So if I set my angle to something like 180, you'll notice we're moving left and right. Finally, we have diamond, and this is just going to, as the name suggests, give you a little diamond shape. And I can increase the size. And very much like the radial gradient, this is going to be defined in size by the proportion of your layer. So if it's too small for you and you just can't make it big enough, consider adjusting the angle to coincide with the longer dimension. Just notice, however, that you are actually spinning that diamond around. So if you actually need the points to face in a different direction, then that's certainly a consideration. So there you go. We've gone through all of the various settings there. Of course, angle is going to behave a little bit differently depending on the style of gradient you're using. And really, the job of the scale slider, if you had to define it, is just to take that area of transition from the beginning to the end of your gradient and to increase or decrease it. That's really all it's doing. Also, once again, remember that you can click and drag over here in your document and place that gradient anywhere it needs to be. At the very bottom, you have Make Default and Reset to Default, just like you do with all of the other layer styles. And that's really all of the settings. I just want to mention, as I did with Color Overlay, that because this is one of the overlay layer styles, that it is a slave to the Blend Interior Effects as Group checkbox. So currently, because this checkbox is off, if I adjust my fill opacity, it looks like nothing is happening. And once again, that's because the underlying pixels are fading away, but the overlay itself is being calculated separately, and so that's still remaining opaque. If we switch on Blend Interior Effects as Group and we pull down our fill opacity, notice that because the gradient overlay is considered one of the overlay effects, obviously, it's going to fade away as well. So just something to remember as a reminder. So that will wrap things up for this video. Thank you very much for watching.